Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Marilyn Suchan, a producer of Catalyst, and today we are talking about music contracts. So sit tight and grab your notebook, okay? Our host today is going to be Charlie McCarron, and I'll be behind the scenes. So again, in the comment section, leave questions, and I will gather those together. So throughout, we can cover all the different topics of the contracts. All right? So without further ado, take it away, Charlie.
Thanks, Mary Lynn.
Welcome.
Yeah, I'm excited to be back for this second part of our music series. We're going to be talking to Paul Bezilla and Alex Mueller, two entertainment attorneys. And I know I have a lot of questions myself as a film composer, but I hope you also in the audience have a lot of questions. So feel free to shoot those in the comments. And before we get started, I do want to plug our third and final part to this music series happening next Tuesday. We have the composer of Rick and Morty, Ryan Elder, and Robert Elhai, who's done 200 orchestrations for huge films like Fast and Furious, the Alien movies, Batman movies. He's done everything. So that will be next Tuesday, May 26th, 3 p.m. Eastern. So now let's get into our talk today. Paul and Alex, I'd like to actually first ask you about your music backgrounds. We know you're lawyers, but how'd you get your start in music? And Paul, maybe I'll start with you because I want to ask you about how you got into the Iowa Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Tell me.
Well, yeah, I'm a bass player. I have been since I was about 15. I played in bands all through high school and college. I was on the road for 3 years before I went to law school. Almost went to Berkeley in Boston, but went to law school instead. I would still rather be a bass player than a lawyer, but it never turned out that way. But I still play. I play bass in an 80s cover band called 80s RPM, which is on hiatus at the moment, of course. But I discovered early that the first rule of all rock bands is they always break up, except for the Rolling Stones. And I found myself as an out-of-work bass player with an undergraduate degree who didn't want to teach, who had a chance to go to law school and figured things were bound to be better afterward than before. And it has turned out that way, fortunately. As I'm fond of telling my clients that it's the music business, and without the business, there wouldn't be much music. But for those of you who may be old enough, and there probably aren't any on this broadcast, I got my start actually working for a company called KTEL. Which used to have a huge compilation business, albums advertised on television. They had a huge office in Minneapolis here. And I was their first in-house lawyer, worked for them for 3 years in Winnipeg, where they were headquartered, and 18 months in Los Angeles before they went bankrupt. And then I went to work for a law firm in Beverly Hills for about 3 years. Firm doesn't exist anymore, but they represented Sinatra was the big client, and they represented Liza Minnelli and Cher and Quincy Jones and all the Warner companies. And then I went to work for the Walt Disney Company for almost 10 years, and I was the music lawyer for the company, everything other than feature films. So it covered television and home video and records and music publishing and the Disney Channel and the theme parks, and I was spread a little thin. I've also worked for Polygram Music Publishing before they were acquired by Universal Music Publishing, and came full circle, worked for KTEL for a short period of time, and I've been here in Minneapolis for about 18 years. I worked for, of all places, American Express for a while, but then have been with my partner Ken Abdo at a couple of different firms, Lohman Abdo and now Fox Rothschild, which is a national law firm with over 1,000 lawyers, and I'm just a cog in the legal machine here, but that's basically me. I do a lot of music work, fair amount of film work and television and books and plays and anything entertainment, essentially.
Yeah, glad to have you here.
Thank you.
And Alex, we know each other from the film composing world.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us, I'll spare the viola jokes. But you're also
right.
a violist.
Most viola jokes are provided by viola players. Little known fact.
Secret. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, tell me about your film music background and how you got into
Yeah,
being...
So I got started in the composition side very early. I was studying composition with a college professor while I was a high schooler. Did a film in college. I got offered a publishing deal for concert music, which is kind of what spurred my interest to learn, as Paul said, the business side of it. And that, through a series of tangents, led to me deciding to go to law school. But I also attended Berkeley and studied film scoring. So I've done film scoring work and lawyer work representing composers, representing filmmakers. I play viola primarily. I've taught Suzuki method, violin, viola, cello, and I play with St. Paul Civic Symphony and with Boom Island String Quartet.
Cool, thanks. Yeah.
Alex is what we call a legit player.
Because I read alto clef.
Well, you read, actually. That's a lot more than I can say for some of my colleagues, but and they're in the rock and roll and jazz worlds.
So, well, I guess speaking of rock and roll, like the first thing I want to ask you about is, because I think it's kind of a mystery maybe for filmmakers who are starting out. Let's say they find, a song on the radio that they want to try to license for their movie. How do they start with that, and who do they talk to?
So this was easier in the days of vinyl records and when you actually bought the CD and had the liner notes, because those notes contain information that told you who wrote it, who the publisher was, and therefore you knew who to contact. You can find some of that information in metadata if you find the song on Spotify or something like that. But honestly, a Google search is a good place to start. And you have to check a couple different places because there's two copyrights at work in a piece of music. There's the underlying the underlying song, what would be on the sheet music, and then there's the recording. And sometimes those are owned by different people. So if you're talking about a big music label, that might be one entity, like Universal has a publishing sub company and a recording label or many labels underneath their big parent company. But in other cases, it's literally two different companies. And so you need permission from both of those if you're going to use the music in a film, because you need what's called a sync license and a master use license. And the sync license is for the underlying composition, and the master use is to use that particular recording done by that particular artist.
How receptive are people to, like, can you even get a hold of people if you don't have, well, I mean, obviously some of those songs is just going to require a lot of money to get their ear maybe, but yeah, what are your experiences with that?
It depends.
It's what you would expect it to be. If you want to license a Rolling Stone song, it's going to cost you a whole lot more money than it is by a local band, an indie band that writes and records their own music. And my cautionary note is always to not get too wedded to Temp Tracks if you can avoid it, because what tends to happen sometimes, and this happens with directors who don't know a lot about music licensing, and they have a temp track and a certain song recording works really well in the chase scene, and then you go to try and license it and you find out that it's going to cost you $50,000, which is more than your entire music budget, or maybe the budget for the film. You never know. So, yeah. And the other caution is, and there is litigation along these lines, is the sort of Soundalike, which I know is on our list maybe for later, but for the movie Ghostbusters, Ray Parker Jr. was the composer. He was instructed by, I'm not sure whom, but to write something that sounded like I Want a New Drug by Huey Lewis and the News. And Ray Parker wrote something that was a little too close, and there was a lawsuit and a settlement, and Huey Lewis didn't have to work quite so hard that year.
Yeah, I always wonder about Soundalikes, like filmmakers, and I've been approached too, like, hey, how close can you get to this other track? And yeah, what's the answer to that? I mean, I have.
There's not a clear answer for sure. The litigation is a lot messier when you're talking about infringing the underlying composition than it is if you actually use a sample of someone else's recording, because that's pretty cut and dry. Like, did you use the recording? Yes, you used it, therefore it's an infringement. If it's, you know, a substantial amount of it and there's money exchanged, it's going to attract more ire than small bits. But the cases that we hear about in the news where there's like bizarre results because a jury listened to the song or they weren't allowed to listen to the song, that's usually litigation concerning the underlying song. So if you play something on bagpipes for a non-musician, they're going to assume it's similar even if the melodies are totally different. It's just an inherent risk in that type of litigation.
Sure.
And
who's liable then? I guess, does it depend on the contract? The composer is, or the filmmaker?
Yeah, you want to spell that out in the contract for sure. When we're representing the composer, we're going to put that liability onto the filmmaker, where we're going to say, if the filmmaker asked you, the composer, to create a sound-alike and it got too close, they should be responsible for that if it's infringing because you kind of made the composer do it. If that's not in the contract, both of them could be liable because they both participated in creating it. And of course, there's going to be this as soon as the lawsuit starts, but that's a good point to bring up in your contract.
Sure.
Paul, you were going to say something. Sorry.
I just wanted to dispel another piece of folk wisdom that goes around from time to time. That people have often asked me, well, can I use 4 bars or 8 bars, or isn't there a 12 bar or 16 bar rule that if I use less than that, I can do it for free? And there is no such rule. And it was alluded to earlier that if you use any recognizable portion of a song without licensing, without clearance, you could be guilty of copyright infringement. And the example I often use is if Beethoven's Fifth Symphony was still subject to copyright, da 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 da, 4 notes, so recognizable, you could be guilty of copyright infringement right there. So, and it often doesn't matter. Just to back up 1 second, another source of information about ownership are the databases of ASCAP and BMI, the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, and Broadcast Music Incorporated. They have databases listing the songwriters and music publishers that they represent. And you can search those databases and see if a title is in there. That will point you to, and often give you an email address or sometimes a phone number to the music publisher or perhaps the songwriter. It does not help you on the recording side. If you need to license the existing recording, that's another piece of research which is not quite as easy.
Mm-hmm. Harry Fox has a database. They're primarily responsible for mechanical licensing, but their database is really helpful if you're trying to find out who the record label is for a particular recording. Because there may be a song that was recorded by 4 or 5 artists, and there's a certain one you want, and then you figure out who the record label is. Another thing to note is that there are people who specialize in this. It's called clearance work when you're trying to obtain a license for film or TV. And music supervisors are people who do that work. There's also sync agents, but music supervisors are folks who have a secret Rolodex. I'm not kidding. They have a secret Rolodex. They can call someone at Universal directly, Sony, and they'd be like, hey, I want this song. Okay, here you go. And it's like, bam. Whereas any of us starting from scratch, has to look in 3 different places to figure out who owns it, try and get through an email slog that they're probably never going to respond to unless you're a name that they recognize. And so it can be really frustrating for indie filmmakers to try and go after big songs by big publishers if you don't use a music supervisor.
And the reference is when she said Harry Fox, that's a reference to the Harry Fox Agency in New York, which does work mostly with mechanical licensing for records, but they do synchronization licensing too on behalf of their publisher principals.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a question kind of related from the audience that is, how do you know if you're paying, the right amount for licensing a song?
That's Really
Yeah.
hard to answer. Like how much should you pay? When you are requesting these licenses, they ask for a lot of information. They want to know as much as possible about your project's budget, what you're going to do with it. They're kind of sizing you up to see what the prospects are for the music. So if you're showing it at a festival, usually you can get a cheaper license, but that license isn't going to allow you to make DVD copies or to sell it, you know, on the market or anything like that. That will only give you festival rights. But that being said, festival rights are going to be cheaper usually than full rights that would let you, you know, do full distribution. Paul, you want to add to that? Like the range of prices you've seen?
Oh, I've seen
uses?
it all over the board. There is the festival licensing, which you can obtain sometimes. It's very limited, as you say. Licensing doesn't cost very much, might not cost anything sometimes. But generally, what people are interested in obtaining is what we call a broad rights license, which would cover you for theatrical, television, streaming, home video, everything throughout the world for the life of the copyright. That's more expensive, obviously. It is possible to do this licensing on an option basis. In other words, you might have a project that it's going to a limited theatrical release initially, or it's going straight to video, or it's only going to streaming. You could purchase those particular rights only, and then have options to expand it to theatrical or expand it to DVD or something else, and you can lock those prices in very often. I always recommend, if you can afford it, to get the broad rights license, because then you don't have to worry down the road. For those of you who might remember the television show Miami Vice, that show was primarily driven by the contemporary music that was included in it at the time. And for whatever reason, I think it was MCA at the time, before Universal, whoever did the music clearance cleared it only for broadcast television. So when the era of DVD came in and everyone was putting out an entire series of Star Trek, an entire series of Friends, an entire series of something else, when they went to do the DVDs for Miami Vice, they found they didn't have the music rights. And I'm saying Universal, they had to go back to the music publishers. And at that point, the music publishers know they've got you. You're going forward with this big project, and they're willing to say no. Because as opposed to mechanical licensing, which is for records only, there's a statute that sets that royalty rate. The license fees for synchronization licensing are completely negotiable. And so what Universal had to do was to drop a lot of music out of those Miami Vice episodes and substitute other music that was cheaper and that sounded sort of the same, but I haven't seen it all, but I can't imagine it's the same production. So it's a long-term view.
Yeah.
There's another question I see along the side that we can actually roll into this same discussion, which is, if I use a small portion of the song, would it save me money? It might. That's one of the questions they ask you when you make a license request is how much, like how long is the scene? They're also going to ask you how it's being used. So if it's source music, it's probably going to be more expensive because it's prominent in the scene. If it's main title or end title music, it may be more expensive because the music is more prominent again. But if it's a very, short segment and it's barely noticeable, it may not cost as much, but it's all negotiated. So it's not something you can say definitively like what it should cost.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. So there was a question actually in the last webcast we had about, can you put a song on hold, and I think what they meant is exclusively license a song. And, would you ever see that where a filmmaker would pay in advance so that, no one else can use this song for a film or TV?
I know that does happen in advertising. When someone licenses a song for a spot, they don't want a competitor being able to license the same song at the same time as them because they want their ad to stand out. Usually those are limited to a term of years so that it expires and then someone else can still license the song. Films have a hard time because your license in general for music, you want it to be, as Paul said, last forever and be good for all mediums. So it's not likely that an artist is going to agree to that for a film.
I could see that scenario happening if you're dealing with an indie band that maybe writes and records all their own material. Even if they had some limited success at the time, they might be, for the right price, they might be willing to hold back a particular recording for a certain period of time. And again, as with everything else in this business, there are a lot of standard customs and practices, but everything is negotiable. So for the right price, I'd be hard pressed to think that a major music publisher would hold back one of their songs on an exclusive option basis for any substantial period of time. But then again, for the right price, they might.
Is the right price like double or triple or even more, do you think?
Again, when Marianne and I were going to give these standard lawyer answers along the way, it depends.
Yeah.
And I hate to keep saying that, but
yeah.
But it depends on the circumstances, the nature of the use, the length of the use, the prominence of the use, and the artist. I'm involved in two projects right now. One is just overseeing music clearance. There's a music clearance organization involved for a network television show that uses a lot of music, and I'm also overseeing some music clearance for an upcoming feature film, which is a sequel to another movie which I can't mention, but they're both very, and the film has a lot of new music written especially for it, artists who want to participate in the project. The television show is a lot of pre-existing music, and it's not always prominent music, but the differences in the pricing are stark. For instance, and these are all broad rights licenses, worldwide, life of copyright, usually expressed as perpetuity, but it's really life of copyright. The license fees for both the recording and the song for a television show might be $5,000 for a 30-second use, maybe even up to a minute and 30 seconds. Those same songs, and I should have mentioned that the feature film has a soundtrack album component to it too, which adds an extra level of complexity. But the fees in that range are for the feature film are probably close to 10 times some of the others. We're talking more in the $50,000 ranges and the $25,000 ranges for different uses, depending on whether it's, and this is probably on our list too, whether it's in context or out of context. A lot of out of context trailers these days, have been for a long time, I guess.
Cool. Yeah. Well, I'd love to shift gears a little bit into composer contracts, because I think maybe for filmmakers who are just starting to work with a composer, what are some, I won't ask you to say what is in an entire contract, but what are some of the key things that you see maybe filmmakers missing in a composer contract that they should be thinking about?
Before we go to what's missing, I guess I think we should talk about what the structure looks like in a broad sense. There's really two. Either you have the film own the copyrights to the music under a scenario known as work for hire, which is a device created by the Copyright Act that transfers the copyright ownership from the original creator to the person commissioning it. So in this case, the film producer would own the rights instead of the composer, whereas the default is that I made it, I own the copyrights. So that's one way. The other way is through a license agreement, whether that's exclusive or non-exclusive or some combination of both of those. But under that arrangement, the composer is going to keep the copyrights and they're giving the filmmaker permission to use the music for that film and that film only. The choice between the two depends on a lot of things. The biggest one is money. If you're a low budget indie film, you probably shouldn't propose work for hire to a composer. They will be offended and not agree to that. And this is hard to say. I'm assuming, Paul, you've worked on both sides of the contract as well. So It's the discussion changes a little bit based on, like who we're representing in the conversation. But a composer doesn't want to part with their copyrights forever without enough money to justify doing that, because they can no longer sell sheet music. They can't make new recordings. They could, maybe perform it live and still get writer's share of royalties, but they're going to want to see a very large number before they'll part with the copyrights. So from the filmmaker side, why do you need to own the copyrights? The truth is you don't. Most instances, you're going to be just fine not owning the copyrights. And in most instances, you're licensing other music anyway. So it's not like you're going to get to a distribution discussion with a distributor and they're going to go, well, do you have the rights to the music? Oh, you were supposed to use work for hire. No, that doesn't happen. They just want to know that you have permission to use the music in the film, whether you actually own the copyrights or whether it's under a licensing arrangement. Either one of those is fine. When you do get to distribution, where you can get into trouble is if you never got anything in writing from your composer. So you would be considered in most jurisdictions to have what's called an implied license, where it's like, I wrote the music for you and I gave it to you. So we assume there was some type of arrangement where I said you could use it because of how did you get it otherwise, but you don't have anything in writing. And that would be something a distributor would flag and maybe get a mess because you have everything locked up.
Yeah. Well, and I guess speaking from personal experience as a composer, and I'm curious, Alex, too, but I basically have worked on indie films that don't have super big budgets, so I have basically kept all the copyrights to my music. But what I will do sometimes is, if someone wants it to be exclusive for a year or something like that, I'll do that, especially if it's a theme for a series or something like that.
Yep. And that's really common. And you don't have to do the same arrangement in terms of the legal stuff for each of the tracks either. Like if they want to own the main title, you could sell them the rights to the main title, but you license everything else to them and keep the copyrights. Composer keeps the copyrights to everything else. Like you can do a mixture of a lot of these things. It's not a clear cut, you have to do this or you have to do that. Paul, you want to chime in?
Yeah, that's really true. I think that holdback period is probably the most important from the composer standpoint. The composer wants to be able to commercially exploit their compositions and their recordings as soon as they can, while giving deference to the film or the television production, whatever it is, to give that some time to run its course. And Alex is right, of course. If you want to own things, it often costs more. And for a composer, the songs are your assets. That's your pension. That's your annuity. That's a great song today is a great song next week and next year and 50 years from now. So I'm a big advocate of creative people trying to hang on to their assets. Although the nature of this business is such that sometimes you have to give something to get something. And I don't really see it on our list, but I learned a long time ago that people do deals in this business primarily for two reasons: money and credit. Not necessarily in that order. There are certain periods during anyone's career, any creative career, where the credit might be more important than the money. So people do things on spec for little or no money. Or I find very often in a lot of these what we call package deals, where a composer gets a net sum of money and they pay for all the costs and deliver the product, and the ownership could be negotiable. But there's a tension, of course, between the two parties, and a good tension. But it's just, and it was true, I think, a number of years ago, where everything was work for hire. Didn't matter. Who
Especially
the
studio
was.
projects.
Yeah. And the studio projects are pretty much still that way, but we've developed along the way. For purposes of this meeting, I pulled 3 contracts that I worked on and not too distant past. One is a completely independent composer that I represented that was doing music for a film. That contract is 3 pages long. I also have a contract for a composer that did a documentary for HBO. That contract is 6 pages long. I also have a contract for a fairly major composer who did a project for a major studio. I think it was Paramount. That contract is 30 pages long.
Yep.
Wow.
So that just
And licenses can be 1 page long.
Yeah. And believe me, Alex and I do not get paid by the word. Only translators get paid by the word, as far as I know. But that just shows you the difference in the business and legal style of the big companies versus the smaller deals.
Yeah.
To touch on a couple other kind of hybrid arrangements, you can have a situation where the composer keeps the rights in the underlying composition. Remember, that's what would be on the sheet music. But the film producer might own the recordings that were made at the scoring session. And there's a bunch of reasons for why that would be. But imagine if you're the producer of the film and you're paying for all those musicians and you paid for the studio time, you paid the composer to write the music, but they are not funding the session. So it's totally reasonable to negotiate, like, I'm producing the recording, so I should own the rights to the recording. Another hybrid option is sharing the publishing and sharing the rights in the recording. So you do something called a co-publishing agreement so that the composer keeps some of the copyrights. It can be a 50-50 split. It can be, 60-45, whatever you want, 60-40. I can do math. 60-40 split, whatever arrangement you want to come up with. But what that does is it allows both the filmmaker and the composer to do things with the work. And why that's important, on studio projects, they're usually work for hire, and the composers are okay with that because the studios have been pretty good about leveraging other channels to make money with the music. So they released a soundtrack album. They create piano books for 4th graders to learn how to play the music on the piano. They do concerts of film music. They do other things with the music besides it existing in that one film, and that's all it gets to do. The average filmmaker doesn't know enough about the music industry to successfully leverage the music in other revenue streams. The composer probably knows that because they're doing it with their other music on their own anyway. So if you come to an agreement where you're splitting those publishing rights, both of you can benefit in that way. But again, that was all negotiable.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, what if it is a 50-50 split and you disagree about something?
Need more context to that question.
Well, like, let's say the composer does want to release a soundtrack. The filmmaker decides, nope, don't want to. But I don't know why they would not want to, but.
Okay. All right. I'm going to try and answer this without seeming dodgy. So sure. It depends what's in your agreement for how you split those rights. But if you're both 50-50 owner of the copyrights with 50% control, you can both do whatever you want so long as you don't do something that ties up the rights exclusively. So if you decide we own this song 50-50 and I want to put it in a toilet paper commercial because toilet paper is the greatest thing in the world right now, and my co-owner says no, unless it's an exclusive license for the toilet paper commercial, they can't stop me.
Okay, good to know.
A couple of things to I just want to chime in on. Going back to work for hire for a second, there's a key element of work for hire, and that is copyright law requires that in order to establish a work for hire relationship, you have to have a signed written document, contract, between the two parties. And it has to use those magic words, work for hire. So if you don't have that contract, and I have used this as leverage on different sides, depending on who I represented. If you're the composer, for instance, and using Alex's example, where the producer paid for the scoring session, there's a natural assumption on most people's part, and I understand it completely, that if they pay for something, they feel that they should own it. Well, the way copyright law works is that copyrightable works are owned on a sort of default basis by the people who create them. And the work for hire situation is, I don't want to say it's an aberration, but it's a vast divergence from the normal way copyright is is perceived as being owned by the creators. So sometimes I've been representing a composer and a filmmaker will say, and we're bickering about something in the contract, and they say, well, I have the recordings. I paid for the recording sessions. I own them. And I said, well, no, sorry, you don't, because you don't have a signed contract that says work for hire. And at the moment, those recordings are owned by all 88 players in the orchestra, plus the producer and the mixer and the engineer and the arranger and other people, assuming there are no contracts with those people. So that can be helpful at certain times. And just to remember, too, this work for hire concept is unique to American law. Work for hire does not exist outside this country. Not in Canada, not in Mexico, not the neighbors, not in Europe, not anywhere.
What's the alternative there?
There is no alternative. The copyrights are owned by the creators.
Well, in the contract sense, there's a way to counter that.
Well, it's an assignment.
Yeah.
They assign all the rights to the filmmaker
and
for the life of the copyright, and there's no termination of that transfer as there is in this country.
Yeah, this came up last year in the Second Circuit Federal Court with scores done by Ennio Morricone, who is Italian and had worked for large U.S. studios and signed a work for hire, challenged it in court, and work for hire doesn't exist in Italy, and they decided that the work for hire was not valid.
Wow.
The New York court decided the work for hire was not valid, and that was long enough ago that it didn't have that safety clause, the assignment that Paul's talking about. So usually in the contract, it'll say, this is a work for hire, just in case it's not, it's an assignment.
So how does
we
that
end up with rights?
So that, I suppose, like, a lot of composers are using orchestras in, Eastern Europe or places. So I guess that's one other thing to have in the contract, like, when you're hiring people.
Yeah, it's a chain of title, just like it works for a piece of land. So everyone that touches that asset has to sign off on it in order for one person to ultimately own it. So in a sense of a recording, you need permission from all of those players that gives anything that they own in the recording to, if it's the composer producing the session, then it all goes to the composer. The composer passes it up, says everything that I produce for you, filmmaker, you own, and then the filmmaker is the one that ends up with all of it in the end. Mm-hmm. But it's a chain of agreements, and that's what your distributors are worried about at the very, very end when you go to sell the film. Like, does every single thing have this chain totally filled in?
Mm. So we have a question. What about tribal law? Have either of you dealt with that?
I have not dealt with it directly. My sense is, my understanding of tribal law, there is a significant degree of sovereignty that is vested in Native Americans. I would have to research it, but my strong sense is that federal copyright law, would override whatever tribal law may be. But I could be wrong.
I don't know the answer to that either. Neither of us practices tribal law.
No, I actually attended a seminar. We represent Treasure Island Casino, and we had an in-house seminar about actually they called it Indian law, which surprised me.
Yeah, that's because of a federal statute that calls it that.
Yeah. But it was put on by some people in our Seattle office who were very well versed in it. But that's the theme that I came away with. I think federal copyright law still governs.
Well, shifting gears again a little bit, I'd like to move into like public domain music, royalty-free library music, and how filmmakers can use that. So let's start with classical music. Those composers who have been dead for a long time, that's all public domain, so we can use everything, right?
No, this is where a lot of people get caught. And there's certain publishers of classical music to stay far away from, because public domain gets very complicated very fast because of international treaties. So something could be public domain in one country and it's not public domain in another. The U.S. is caught up in a very murky area with I can't remember. Paul, do you remember what year those earliest works are starting to go into public domain, like Holst and Stravinsky and those?
Yeah, no, I don't. I don't. I know, of course, a work can be in public domain in one country and not public domain in another country. And the copyright terms of different countries are very different. I once spent about 3 months of my life, this is before laptop computers and spreadsheets, calculating the copyright expiration dates of all the George and Ira Gershwin compositions in every country of the world that had a copyright law. And for instance, in certain countries that were heavily involved in World War II, France, for instance, copyright law was suspended in those countries during World War II. And then those years were added on to the copyright at the end. So World War II lasted a different length of time in France than it did in England, than it did in Spain or in Italy. So this can be very tricky. Alex said it's very murky sometimes because there are international treaties, the Rome Convention, the Berne Convention, where countries, the member countries to these treaties have essentially agreed to give the same protection in their country to foreign copyright owners. They get the same protection in our country that they get in their home country. One of the big stumbling blocks for a long time for the U.S. Joining some of these treaties was something called moral rights. I don't know if you've heard of it before. It's in the French, it's the droit moral. And it's a very strong copyright concept outside of this country, especially Europe and in South America, where even if someone assigns you the full ownership of a copyright for the length of that copyright, you can't really change or destroy the fundamental character of that work. In fact, when colorization of movies started a number of years ago, we don't see it much anymore, but there were certain European directors who sued American film companies for colorizing their movies. And they're tricky issues, but they were successful. So we don't have that concept in American copyright law. And the fact that we don't have it was an impediment to us joining some of these treaties because we couldn't give that same protection here. That's gotten worked out to a certain degree. But you will see in these contracts, composer contracts, especially the larger companies, they will ask the composer to waive, in other words, not ever enforce any moral rights that they may have. So we have it's a long way of saying we have a different contracting landscape in this country than exists outside this country for composers and work for hire.
And the other big important thing about public domain is you have to remember that there's two copyrighted works involved. There's the underlying composition, and then there's the recording. So even though Mozart is long dead, definitely public domain everywhere in the world, a recording is probably not, because we don't really have very many recordings that are old enough to fall into public domain.
Yeah. So like personally, what I've done once in a while is take an older composition and then do a remix of it myself in take MIDI version, sometimes use like sampled instruments or something like that when the director really wants this Wagner piece.
Yeah, or I mean hire players and record it yourself, then you own that recording. But if you are using someone like Cerise Farabond or Sony Classical, if you're using someone else's recording, you're going to get nailed on copyright because they own the recording, even if they don't own the underlying music that they recorded.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to bring up, I forgot it earlier. As far as these split ownership copyright situations, if a composer is considering maintaining a 50% ownership in a song, maybe conveying the ownership of the recordings to the film company, or even in a work for hire situation, I think a composer has to take a hard look at the company they're working with and ask some sort of difficult questions. Number one being, do they have any sort of music publishing administration capability? The question being, why should you convey all your music publishing rights to someone who doesn't know how to deal with them, who doesn't know how to collect performance revenues that might be generated in England or France or Greece, or how to collect, we haven't touched on this one yet, neighboring rights royalties, which I can explain. But there are, and one thing I want to dispel too, and it hasn't come up fortunately in the questions, but I run into a lot of people, and maybe they're not as sophisticated as they should be, but they feel that by registering their song with ASCAP or BMI, that has some sort of copyright function to it. And people need to remember that what ASCAP and BMI do, they are not these massive copyright clearinghouses. They do one thing, and they do one thing only. They collect what are called public performance royalties. When a piece of music is performed on television or on the radio or in nightclubs or bars, anywhere in public, they collect royalties for that. They take an administration fee off the top. They pay half, the remainder to the publisher and half to the writer. And that's really all they do. Like I said earlier, they do have this database that they maintain, which allows you to search and find the copyright proprietors of different songs in their database and their catalog. But that's really all they do. And it's another way of saying, register your copyrights if you can afford to with the Copyright Office. It's what I call cheap insurance. And I'm sure Alex would get to this, but if you have registered your copyright, well, copyright is completely federal jurisdiction. You can't go down to your local state court and sue somebody for copyright infringement. I mean, you can, it's maybe some sort of local copyright law, but it's really federal court jurisdiction. It's expensive, it's time consuming, and you really don't want to do it unless you have to, or unless there's enough at the end of the rainbow. But these days you cannot file that federal infringement claim unless you've registered your copyright. And there are advantages if you sue someone for infringement. If you do win, the other side has to pay your legal fees. There are also damages called statutory damages built into the Copyright Act for different levels of infringement that you would get automatically. So it's a good practice to get into. And it's all done online. Nobody wants to mess with the paper anymore. So
yeah. So speaking of ASCAP and BMI, some, I think, filmmakers maybe aren't as familiar with like what is a cue sheet, and I just want to put a plug in. Just make sure you do one. Your composer will probably remind you to do that. But one thing I'm wondering about too is like a situation came up where, you know, I composed half, used half library music, but there's still composers who wrote that music. So did they go in the cue sheet also? And
okay,
yeah,
how
does that work?
Let's back up a few steps. So cue sheet's a spreadsheet that you submit to the public performance organizations that has a list of every piece of music that appears in the film, start to finish, how long it played, and then who the writer was, who the publisher is. And that spreadsheet is what they're using to track who should get paid royalties. Now, when we're talking about royalties and library music, there's confusion because you hear this term thrown around, royalty-free. What that means is that you, the filmmaker, don't have to pay royalties to continue using that music. So imagine a situation, it'd be weird for film anyway, but imagine a situation where you license a song for a year, and then after a year, they want more money, and then after another year, they want more money again. I mean, this is how podcasts work, and there's other media where it made sense to do this, but a film, you kind of want to pay once, and then it just exists. So that's what we're talking about with royalty-free. You, the filmmaker, are not paying royalties. There are still royalties generated, however, for the composer and for the publisher whenever that film is shown somewhere that generates public performance royalties. As Paul said, if it's streamed, if it's on television, if it's shown in a theater in a foreign country, we don't have performance rights for US theaters, but we do for other countries. And that's what ASCAP and BMI are collecting. They're getting money from the venues that are showing the film. They're getting money from the network that shows the film in the form of blanket license fees. They collect all of that in a pool of money. Then they look at the spreadsheet and they go, whose music got played? And then they pay that person the appropriate amount of pennies. So you, the filmmaker, pay once, you're done. But that's just so you know, when we're talking about royalty free, that's what we're talking about. You're not trying to eliminate in the it's a contract with your composer and they start talking about royalties, that's what they're talking about is public performance royalties, not royalties that you pay them. Okay.
Yeah.
So to Charlie's question, if you have music from multiple sources, you need to make sure that all of those things are accurately detailed in that spreadsheet. So if you license a piece of music, doesn't matter where it comes from, they'll tell you who's supposed to be on that cue sheet, but that piece of music still needs to be on the cue sheet as well as your composer that wrote original music for you. If you license a song, same thing. Publisher, writer goes in the cue sheet.
Yeah. So thanks for that. I think we want to switch now to some audience Q&A, just to make sure we get those questions in. So Marilyn, what do we have? Okay, how does a composer maximize income potential with a song recording? Does one need to get a lawyer involved? There you go.
Excuse me.
That's really, really broad. Can we teach the music industry in 2 minutes, Paul?
I don't think so. I mean, I think as long as you're registering your song with all the appropriate collection agencies and societies and organizations, that will put you in good stead. There are certain lawyers, for instance, who do shop songs, try to get them to music publishers or producers or artists or maybe even film companies who were not really in the placement business. I don't personally do that, but it can be done. Sometimes you have to get some kind of representative out there. In the last 10 years, I've seen the music business become filled with people who I generically say are in the placement business. My sense is most of them are former record company or music publishing company people who were laid off and realized they will never find another job like they had before that paid what it did. But they have a pretty good contact list. And some of their contacts are music supervisors. So, and they go fishing sometimes too. They will approach people and say, we like your song, we like your recording, we think we can do something for you, licensing it to third parties. And the standard deal is they want 50% of the revenue. And sometimes what they will do too is they will retitle the song for purposes of the particular TV or film project so that they can collect part of the publisher's share of public performance royalties. So there's a lot of that out there. I counsel people to make those deals as short as they can, maybe a year or two if they're exclusive. Mm-hmm. Don't pay more than 50% if you can avoid it, because you just never know whether these are going to work or not. Bottom line, I'm not sure the lawyer's going to help you that much.
Yeah, that's been my experience too. Lawyers are kind of a very good thing to have in your pocket when you have an opportunity you want to size up, but we're not really the source for going out and finding those opportunities for you, other than like I happen to hear a client has a project going on. I go, oh, you should meet this other client. It's like it happens, but that's not the primary goal. One plug for lawyers, as Paul alluded to earlier, there's kind of this career trajectory. You start with the 3-page agreement, then you get the 6-page agreement, then you get the 30-page agreement. And so you should definitely consider working with an attorney when you're on the 3-page agreement so that you are learning what to think about and how to successfully start. Don't wait until you have the 30-page agreement, don't know what you're doing, and now you're trying to get a lawyer to help you because you're going to spend a lot of time to have them teach you things you should have learned by this point.
And that 3-page agreement may be missing as much important material as it contains.
Yes,
I'm
I've seen that a lot.
Advocate of short documents, but sometimes they're just too short. Yeah. And it's a challenge. I learned a long time ago that if you put something longer than a page in front of a musician, they will freak out. And say, oh, I have to get a lawyer. No, I don't understand. I'll just forget the whole thing. And so I try to keep things really, really short. And look, I'm a musician. I say this with all love and respect, but I understand the dynamic that's involved too. And
yeah,
it's a love-hate thing with lawyers, you know.
Mm-hmm. All right, we another question for us, Marilyn. Can you give us an idea of what the rates are for using a music rights clearance service? Is it a percentage of the total negotiated cost or a flat fee?
It can be both, actually. They might search for what you want for a flat fee, but they might actually use a commission structure where they're getting a portion of whatever that sync license ends up being. It kind of depends which side they're working on. Paul, what have you seen?
I've seen both or either. Again, I think it's negotiable. It depends on who you're dealing with and how busy they are, or how hungry they are. Personally, I like the flat fee situations. I think it evens out a little bit better. But it depends on the nature of the project and what your budget is.
Yeah. Any other questions out there?
We're not trying to be difficult by not giving real numbers. There's just some issues with us giving real numbers.
Yep. Understandable. Well, I have a few random questions. Maybe that'd be interesting. So, what happens if you are recording something for a documentary, say, and you get some background music from a restaurant or something like that? How does that work?
It depends. It's in some instances it's going to depend how audible it is. Like if you can clearly make it out. It also might depend heavily whose song it is, how litigious they are. There are attorneys who specialize in fair use analysis who would watch your film and make a detailed list for you of all the things that appear in it, and then they give you a kind of a risk estimate of whether they think that you should try and remove it or blur the images in the background or all of those things. But it's very context specific. It's not like a question we can answer in definitive.
Sure.
What I have told people along the way is the question of whether to license or not to license, or research or not research, can depend on what your tolerance for risk is. And by that I mean, the good news is there are no copyright police out there. The bad news is it's a lot easier these days to track a music usage than it was before, I think 20 years ago, for instance. So it is possible to put music into audiovisual productions and hope for the best. And then if you get that nasty cease and desist letter, you say, well, I'm just a small independent film composer. I didn't know, mea culpa. I won't do it again. And I'm not saying you won't get sued, but the chances, unless there's a lot of money involved, unless it's a film is making a bunch of money, if you probably won't get sued. You never know. But it doesn't make any sense to try to collect money from a film composer that's just purely creative, doesn't have hardly any money, and why even bother?
And it's a strategy of some publishers. They will let you get away with it essentially until you're successful, because there's a 3-year statute of limitations for copyright infringement. And so they get to start from when you started making money, because now you've created damages for them that they can pursue.
And this is part and parcel of what Alex was saying at the very beginning, that there are certain delivery elements that you have to have when the filmmaker goes to the distributor. The distributor wants to see the chain of title. They want to see the licenses. They want to make sure everybody has represented and warranted in the right ways and agreed to indemnify in the right ways. And that's where this all gets sifted out at certain points. And if you can't fulfill the delivery requirements under the distribution agreement, if you can't qualify for errors and omissions insurance because of a glitch in your licensing or your chain of title, it's going to mess up the whole project. So, and then the crazy thing about music sometimes is that the music is finished at the end of the film, when all the time is gone and when all the money is gone, and it's one of the most difficult times. And so the planning on the front end is really critical, so you don't get crunched at the end as a composer.
Yeah. Good final words of wisdom. And with that, we're basically at the hour mark here. So thank you both for being here. And I think a lot of people will benefit from this talk. So thanks.
Very good. Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you.